This video is about last man standing clauses in GP partnership agreements. The BMA said a few years ago that every GP practice should have a last man standing clause. I couldn't disagree less. It's a judgment call for each practice to make, and there's no right or wrong answer to it. What GP partnership agreements generally used to do, what I still call the orthodox position, is that when one partner retires, the other partners buy him or her out, pay him out, and carry on the business as they were before. But of course, that gives rise to the risk of successive retirements without recruitment. So partner 5 is bought out by the 4, partner 4 then leaves and is bought out by the remaining 3, 2, 1, and you're left with a last man standing. That's a risk that successive generations of GPs have got comfortable with, but of course the recruitment problems that we've seen over the last few years do put that in a slightly different light. So what you say in your partnership agreement if you don't want to have that risk of last man standing, well, instead you say that when partner number 5 gives his retirement notice, the other 4 have to have a think and they have to make a decision. They either say, yes, partner 5, off you go into the sunset, we'll buy you out and pay you out in the normal way and we will continue the practice as a foursome, or they say, no, we can't carry on as a 4. We will wind up the practice and split the costs 5 ways. Now, it's unlikely to happen at that point, but it might happen at that point or at that point. And a clause like that ensures that you don't get a single unwilling single-hander at the end of it. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with being a single-hander per se. There are plenty of happy single-handers out there who are content to have all the responsibility of running the practice themselves and all the control. But the real problem comes when a single-hander wants to stop being a single-hander and wants to retire. If they can't find anyone to carry on the practice, then they have to hand back the contract, and you get 2 main costs arising. 1, you have to pay redundancy to all the staff, and 2, you've got premises costs, which either means paying off the lease rent for the remainder of the term, or it means suffering a depreciation in value of the freehold building. And that's the particular financial concern that a last man or last partner standing will have. It's worth, though, thinking about whether you really need a last man standing clause to guard against those 2 financial risks, because for many practices, if they hand back the contract, the financial cost of those 2 risks will be at or close to 0. For most, or at least many practices, if the contract is handed back, then the premises are really the only place that primary care can be delivered from, and so the commissioner will effectively have to put a caretaker practice in place or run it themselves. If that happens, then all the staff transfer by SHUPE to the new provider, so there are no winding up costs, there are no redundancy costs. And if that happens, then the new occupier will have to pay the rent, at least initially, and so there shouldn't be any diminution in the value of the building either if it's a freehold building. So anyone thinking about putting in place a last man standing clause in order to avoid those 2 particular risks should think first, well, what are those risks? Can we get an idea of quantifying them before we insert a last man standing clause? Because there are downsides to last man standing clauses. First, it increases uncertainty for partners closer to retirement in particular, and they might try to get out while the going is still good. So you might, in fact, precipitate the collapse of the practice by having such a clause in theory. Secondly, I wonder whether they really are that much protection for incoming partners at the bottom of the pile, just starting out. Does it give you that much comfort to be told that in a worst case scenario, you'll only have to bear half or a third of the winding up costs, rather than all of them, particularly if those winding up costs are going to be pretty close to zero. And these clauses can, of course, precipitate the winding up of the practice when perhaps it wasn't necessary. If the partners wound up when there were only 3 of them left, perhaps if they'd gone down to 2, they might have weathered the storm, been able to recruit and put the practice back on its feet. We will never know, because the last man standing clause meant that the practice was wound up early. So there are pros and cons, and I think it's worth every practice looking at their own particular profile, their own ability to recruit, their own premises situation, and the ability of the commissioner to disperse the list before they decide whether a last man standing clause is right or wrong for them. And I'd be very happy to help with those discussions further on a one-on-one basis.